Thank you so much for being with us.
My pleasure, thank you.
Can you please just start off by telling us about your latest project, the Vietnam War?
So on Sunday, September 17th, PBS nationally and KPBS locally will begin broadcasting our 10-part, 18-hour series on the history of the Vietnam War. It's probably the most complicated and ambitious project that I have ever undertaken, along with my co-director, Lynn Novick. It's about the most important event in the second half of the 20th century for Americans, this incredibly divisive war that has in some ways set the stage for how we are now, and the divisions in our country today, this kind of binary response that I'm right and you're wrong, have their seeds in Vietnam, and yet it's a war we don't talk about. It's a war we lost, and so there's a great deal of pride involved here, but there's also a great deal of pain and sorrow, and people haven't opened up. And new scholarship and new information and declassified things over the last 42 years since the fall of Saigon have provided us with a wealth of material. And we set out to tell, obviously, the American side with more than 50 Americans, Marines and GIs and draft dodgers and Gold Star mothers and helicopter pilots and bomber pilots and nurses and doctors and POWs and policy wonks in the Pentagon. But we also interviewed North Vietnamese civilians and North Vietnamese soldiers and Viet Cong guerrillas and South Vietnamese soldiers and civilians, and all of them provide a very complex portrait of a war. In some cases, we have a battle, and we've got people on all three sides of the battle talking about that battle and the moment that it happened. A Viet Cong guerrilla firing at a U.S. Marine advisor and his ARVN, South Vietnamese Army counterpart, a Marine as well. And they're three of the bravest people I've ever met. And they're telling you about a little-known battle. So what we wanted to do, it's often called the living room war. It really wasn't. The nightly news gave us just a little flavor of what was going on. Every once in a while, a documentary or a big event like the Tet Offensive would open it up. But we didn't, we think we knew that war, and we don't. And what our film is an attempt is to make it real, and this time really bring it into your living room.
And this is years in the making.
We've been working on this for more than 10 years. We were finishing up, Lynn and I were also co-directed a film called The War, about the Second World War, and we were finishing up, and we realized, we've got a trilogy here: the Civil War, the most important event in American history; World War II, the most important event, cataclysm in world history; and then the Vietnam War, which is in the last 50, 60 years the most important event in American history, and so revealing of how we are now. And we thought that maybe if Vietnam was the seeds of a virus that we caught, that maybe by telling a complete story it might permit us to relax, to begin to heal, to have kind of courageous conversations that would allow reconciliation between us to take place. And maybe we could elevate, as we try all the time in PBS, elevate our conversation to a civil discourse and not the kind of, cable television noise and hash and where you always have to make the other person wrong. We set a table, we permitted in this film diverse number of truths to coexist and still be truths, because for that person who was opposed to the war, that was going to leave for Canada or was just saying, look, this is not right, that was a truth for them. But so was the person who, from the moment they were in high school knew, I'm going into the Marines, I'm going to fight against communism, and where we're fighting it is in Vietnam, and maybe they change their minds in the course of the war, maybe they don't. All of those are coexisting along with our enemy and our allies and the folks back home who are suffering losses or are confused about it. And it's as epic a story as we've ever tried to tell.
And did you find people were reluctant to talk about it or relieved?
There's a combination of that. Because we haven't talked about it, a lot of these memories are buried pretty deep. And there's something incredibly special about sitting in an interview and realizing this person probably hasn't spoken to this, that you are present for the birth of expressed memory. And that's a huge responsibility for us. We have to protect it. We don't have to, just because somebody else that we've interviewed disagrees with the actions of that person, we don't have to make either of those people wrong. We can just tell their stories and intertwine and interbraid them together into a very, almost like a Russian novel of lots of different characters and lots of different levels. And some people you see in every episode, some people come on for an episode or two, some people just come on once, some people are on dozens of times, but they're nonetheless woven together in a way that we tried to respect that. So yeah, it was tough to get stuff out, and it's very moving. And a Gold Star mother, there's every reason on earth why she doesn't have to relive it for our cameras, but she did, and it's incredibly poignant. And some of the veterans who now go back to Vietnam to try to make sense of it and meet their counterparts who are getting old, or grandpas now, as one of our Army guys say, that's very, very moving. And it may be possible for us to move beyond the sort of, as one of our guys says, Vietnam stuck a dagger in America that we haven't recovered from. Let's recover from it. Let's have a conversation about it. And by hearing all these stories, and all wars are the same and all wars are different, and this one is, you know, you'll recognize stuff in the Civil War and World War II all the way back to the Greek Wars, and then there's stuff that's so particular that I think in every episode our viewers are going to go, I had no idea. And the reason why I know that is because I went in thinking, I know about this war. And it was a daily humiliation how little I knew. I grew up during it. I had a high draft number. I thought I knew what had happened, and I realized that I didn't, and everything I learned changes it. And when we had screenings for our historical consultants, they knew their area of expertise, but they were flabbergasted at the areas they didn't know. And more importantly, our veterans, who represented a cross-section of American society, of political beliefs, were constantly going, I had no idea that that was going on too. So you get into the mind because of the tapes that LBJ and Richard Nixon had in the White House, you get into the intimate decision making, and you can see a speech that Nixon gives, and then the next hour a conversation that completely is the opposite of that speech. The same with LBJ, and you begin to understand the layers of deceit that happened on all three governments. This is the story of three countries. Us, North Vietnam and South Vietnam. Then there wasn't a South Vietnam, so it ends up being about two countries at the end. And that population is largely in Southern California in the United States, the people who lost a country. But none of the governments told the people what was going on. None of the governments were making decisions that might necessarily have been best for the people who were actually doing the fighting and the dying. And that's an interesting revelation.
In something as well documented as the Vietnam War, there have been movies and several books. How do you take an event like that and tell it in a fresh way?
Well, I think you aggregate all of the strengths of those things. I mean, a lot of the Hollywood movies are fictions, so you have to just say, well, that's a fictionalized version. There was a great series on public broadcasting in the early 80s, but that was at 30,000 feet. How could it not be? They didn't have access to Vietnam. We did. We traveled the country, interviewed lots of people, got access to archives, and that permitted us to have a fresh view of what happened, and then the scholarship has really opened it up. So most people, I think, except for a few scholars, will say, I had no idea this happened. And that'll happen 1,000 times watching it, because it still does to me. I go, wow, we're so lucky we discovered that, we unearthed that. And then we fact-checked for more than a year and a half. I mean, in public broadcasting, facts still matter. And so, you know, even though we'd locked the film, meaning the editing was done, we unlocked every episode when we found out that it was not late Thursday night, it was actually early Friday morning. It was just after midnight when something happened, so that's no longer Thursday, that's Friday. Or it was 4 regiments, not 3 regiments, or it was 3 regiments, not 4. We wanted to get that right, but it's just the avalanche of information that the guy we thought was the leader of our enemy, North Vietnam, Ho Chi Minh, was in fact in 1959 engaged with unbelievable power struggles with other people whose names I guarantee 99.99% of our audience have never heard of before. And wouldn't it be important to know who we were actually fighting, who the head of the country was? And if our president didn't know at the time, isn't that important to understand your enemy, to know what they are capable of, what their strategies are? It's a fascinating, fascinating story. And to see the bravery, I mean, I'm one of the journalists gets mad at the idea that World War II is the greatest generation. The combat that he observed in Vietnam, he said, the American soldiers were as brave as anybody in World War II. And that's another important thing. The biggest lesson of Vietnam that we've learned, and we've forgotten a lot of the lessons, the biggest lesson that we've learned and we will never forget is that we are no longer going to blame our warriors. We're going to celebrate them, and that's what this film does.
And on the other side of that, that period was also very well known for its major anti-war protests. How did those protests compare to demonstrations we're seeing today?
Well, it's very interesting that, when we started this film 10 years ago, if I told you that this film was about a White House obsessed with leaks, that it was about big document drops of classified government information, that it was about mass demonstrations taking place across the country, that it was about asymmetrical warfare, you say, boy, you've abandoned American history, you're talking about the present moment. But these are the stories of Vietnam, and those protests, you begin to see that sometimes bravery doesn't always take place on the battlefield. The choices people made in the United States and elsewhere about the war. We've met brave people in all three of those countries that their bravery didn't necessarily take place on the battlefield. They're making decisions and choices that affected them and for the rest of their lives and their families and their communities. This is a hugely important story to get our head around and not just be reactive, to finally get to a place where we could have the courageous conversations we absolutely have to have.
You have been, in the past, critical of now President Donald Trump and some of his ideas. Now that we're well into his presidency, past the first 100 days, how do you feel about the job he's doing?
Well, I gave one speech a year ago, in which for the very first time in my professional life, I spoke out politically, and I warned about certain tendencies that I felt in the then candidate and presumptive nominee of the Republican Party, and that was it. I've gone back, particularly in this film, to calling balls and strikes in the historical realm, and so I'm not so much interested in commenting on the current political things, but I do want to say that I think that the remedies to any kind of dissatisfaction in the current political situation can be helped out by a solid knowledge of history, and particularly the divisions that we experience today. My belief is that they had their birth during the Vietnam War. By understanding that war, we might be better armed, red state, blue state, Republican, Democrat, patriot, whatever it is, to know how to deal with the incredibly real challenges that we face today. And that's the role of public broadcasting, is to be umpires and not put our thumb on the scale and be advocates of some political agenda or some propaganda. I've never been interested in that, and I was speaking as a private citizen when I made a few minutes remarks in a much longer commencement address that I gave at Stanford University a year ago. So I'm not in the politics business, I'm in the history business, and there you have to be completely fair.
And what do you hope people get after watching this series, The Vietnam War?
We work really hard, not thinking, aha, this is speaking to Afghanistan or Iraq, or this is speaking to the Trump presidency or the Obama presidency. Our job is to spend 10 years trying to tell a good story, and we think we've done that. When it's over, it's no longer my film, it's your film, and you'll have your reactions, and I'll be so surprised that you felt this way about that scene. I hadn't seen that before, or maybe, yes, many of our consultants or the people that we brought in to screen it felt that way as well. The important thing is you want people to feel. You want them to have not that conventional wisdom squash the life out of them. Oh, Vietnam, I know what that was about. Or the wrong sort of superficial knowledge about something. You want to go, I just want you to say, I had no idea. And then form your own opinion, because that's what having a conversation is about. For me to tell you how to react to this is we're right back to the same thing, where I'm going to get the guy who believes it's a round earth and a guy from the Flat Earth Society and let them duke it out. And that's not what we want to do. We want to have a place where people's views are respected, and we've done that here, and I think it adds dimension to the story of the Vietnam to understand what was going on in North Vietnam on the battlefield and on the home front, and the same with South Vietnam on the battlefield and on the home front. And we've done that certainly here. That's our major job, but we've also helped you understand the war by showing these other perspectives. And so I hope it's just a shaking of the head and go, wow, that's a good story.
Ken Burns, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.